So I won't dwell on this. There's a lot of information on here, but this just is a slide that sort of shows some of the projects that I've worked on recently. Some of them were mentioned in the introduction. But a lot of this work developed out of an initial project that I did in Pakistan. It's gone on to work that I did in India, and particularly work that I've been doing for the last several years in sub-Saharan Africa, so countries like Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal, or now I'm working in places like Ethiopia and Sudan. So next slide, please. So one of the things that came out, the original Pakistan project used a tool that maybe some people in the audience don't recognize, a tool called Skype, or maybe everybody remembers Skype, but nobody uses it anymore. But this was the local tool that was suggested by the Ministry of Education, and we started off using Skype in the same way that we're using Zoom to broadcast to large numbers of people. This was very novel at that time. And we also used PowerPoint in the way that we're using PowerPoint here as a kind of way of managing the process. But one of the things that we started experimenting with was mobile phones. And mobile phones were quite low tech then. They weren't the smartphones. We're talking about either feature phones, as we would refer to them, phones that basically you had a little screen on, but they didn't have much feature. So we were using text to exchange. Now, at the same time, if you go to the next slide, I was doing some work in India, and we were collecting a set of case studies about different practice within Indian, not just schools, but in colleges, in universities, in formal and formal education. And one of the groups was a WhatsApp community of physics teachers. Now, the area where these teachers worked was a very dispersed area, and they set up this WhatsApp community to actually do the sort of things that we were trying to do in Pakistan. So I picked up on this idea, and I moved this into the work that I did in Jordan. So if you move to the next slide. So we worked, the first project that I used WhatsApp on was with teachers who are refugees in Jordan. And one of the things that was quite difficult there was the actual access. So these guys were living in a refugee camp, and the clear problem that they had was with access to actually being able to use this technology, even though it's a fairly basic technology. And we also really, I realized at the time that the WhatsApp independently wasn't going to work. So we tried also to introduce Zoom into that process as well. And what came out of that and what fed into other projects was that idea of providing additional resource in terms of access, so that the teachers who live in difficult circumstances, who live in remote contexts, can actually use their mobile phones in a meaningful way. So if you move to the next slide. Okay, so this was a project we conducted in Cote d'Ivoire, and again, I won't focus on a lot of the detail of this, but one of the things, if you look at point 3, we were trying to continue to evaluate the role of social media and facilitating communities of practice. So I know you worked on issues around communities of practice in your own work in Indonesia. So that idea of establishing communities was important to us. So if you move on to the next slide. So this took up the ideas that we wanted a more blended approach. So we were doing sort of blended approaches at that time. So this was pre-pandemic. We were supposed to be going on 3 or 4 visits to this particular small town where there are a number of schools, and doing work, and you can see some of the activity that went on. So next slide. So, but even so, we had some remote work. So it's probably very difficult to see this, but in the top right-hand corner, there were people who were remote. There were people who were sitting in Manchester and who were communicating, doing part of the session alongside the people who were in the particular sort of small town where we sat, where we were running the seminar. Next slide. But the pandemic intervened, and it meant that we had to move online. Now, this was a context where, although WhatsApp we used WhatsApp as part of this, it wasn't that easy to get the teachers to make use of WhatsApp, because the particular context and maybe their beliefs about the role of the tools wasn't in tune with the kind of things that we were doing. So we ended up mostly using Zoom, in fact. So we use Zoom in a variety of different ways. So if you look at the next slide. So as well as larger group, we also worked with very small groups. Now, there were 2 or 3, even though you see me on the left-hand side and somebody else, that represented 3 or 4 teachers. So what they would do is they would connect with one phone, they would sit in a classroom together, and they would communicate with me. So we use this as a way of providing mentoring. And if you see in the right-hand side, as well as me, there was also a local teacher or a local teacher developer. So Apia Kuadio on the left there was actually the head of the teacher development unit in the Ministry of Education in Côte d'Ivoire. So we were working with local mentors. So there was a mixture of things going on. So the idea of using technology that we had was as a support mechanism. So as well as running a WhatsApp group, which eventually, if you move on to the next slide, eventually, if you skip that one, I'll come back to that later if people are interested. As well as using, the tools like WhatsApp and Zoom, we realized that we needed local people to liaise with. So, there was a lot of collaboration between ourselves in Manchester and the people, the teacher developers who were working in the local context. So it was a very multifaceted approach. So we were using Zoom, but Zoom was not being used in the way that we're using it today. It was used for small group work. We used WhatsApp. WhatsApp ended up being used for management purposes. And we also made quite a lot of use of Padlet. We realized that Padlet, which I'm not sure whether you'll know what Padlet is, but essentially it's a kind of display tool. We were using Padlet as a kind of virtual learning environment. So materials were being presented on Padlet, partly because we realized that in WhatsApp, where we initially tried to present the materials, they kind of disappear. They scroll up the screen, and then you end up not being able to see them anymore. And if you see there some of the feedback here, this was a particular way of teaching. We used a kind of action research. It isn't called action research, it's called inquiry based practice, but we used a mechanism to get the teachers to investigate their own classroom. So this was some of the sort of positive feedback we had from them. So if you move on to the next slide. So, there were some issues with this project, but they weren't that insurmountable. But we did find that, some of the initial ideas we'd had about WhatsApp weren't necessarily working in the way we wanted. So this was something, that this was my original proposal. This was something that I was really keen on, but I kind of realized that you kind of needed a tool like Zoom to actually support that. And in fact, Zoom took over as essentially a way of making that work. So if you move on to the next slide. So I then went on to actually, I was invited by the British Council to do a bit of a report on this kind of practice. So if you skip this slide, and rather than we developed a questionnaire, or I developed a questionnaire, you probably can't see that, but we got responses from a lot of countries. And you know, there were particular kind of countries that where you get more response than others. So India there in the middle, and Mali in sub-Saharan Africa. That was partly because of, you know, my contacts there, and partly because people were involved in the project. So, you know, we managed to get quite a lot of data from a lot of different contexts about this use of different kinds of social media to you know, work in this distance way with groups of teachers. So next slide. And you know, we found you know, some, I mean, in a way, the findings we got supported a lot of the ideas that had been worked on in other contexts. So, you know, if you look at that top bullet point, there's no other support for these teachers. So a lot of these teachers don't get any other support. So if they have a mobile phone and can use WhatsApp and other kinds of tools, then this is a possibility for actually working with them in this kind of way. You know, so you get a situation where a lot of ideas and materials are shared. You can have training sessions. You know, and when training sessions are actually run, they're valued. People like them. They take the ideas. They might not contribute. So one of the big issues with, you know, WhatsApp communities of practice or Telegram communities of practice or whatever other tool you're thinking of using is that you don't necessarily get as much interaction as you'd like. So it's often dominated by a few people. But what this data showed was that even if they don't contribute, they're often reading the material, they're taking that material, they're using it in their classes, and you know, they may make occasional contributions. And this, you know, these groups provide you know, both a pedagogical but also a psychosocial support. So one of the things we learned in the pandemic very strongly was that teaching's not, you know, it's not just about the content. Content's obviously important. It's not about developing knowledge. It's also about the emotional support that is actually happening between the teachers and the learners, but between other teachers. So teachers are often very isolated in the kinds of contexts I work in. They're very isolated. They don't necessarily have that much contact with other teachers. And here they've got a community that they can work with, you know, who will respond to their question about, well, I can't work out how to teach this. You know, how am I going to do that? And that goes way back to those physics teachers I mentioned in India, and that's exactly what they were doing. So they were actually engaging with the physics curriculum. They were swapping materials and so on. You know, so there was quite a lot of evidence that came out of this survey that the sort of tools that, you know, I'd been advocating for quite a long time by then were actually working in all sorts of ways. And right at the bottom there, it's very difficult to capture it, but there is some evidence that the kinds of groups that we're talking about actually impact on learner outcomes, and that's something that needs more work. You know, how to get yourselves into a situation where you can do a study that really does sort of show sort of impact on learner outcomes, but there was a certain amount of evidence that's happening. So next slide. So, I mean, you know, from my perspective, if you're going back to this sort of set of questions that I was asked, where I was asked to reflect on, you know, the ideas was, I wasn't asked by those questions, but there was a group of questions, but it got me to reflecting on those issues over time. And if I'm going to work in a particular context, picking a particular tool to do a certain job with, and as I say, I've been working on this for quite some time now, you know, you can use these tools in all sorts of ways. I mean, there also people talk about all sorts of other things, but these tools can be used. Um, and so it's possible to run teacher development sessions in low resource contexts, using technology, but hopefully there's some kind of local mentoring as well. Now that might just be within school groups. So in the project that we ran in Cote d'Ivoire, um, there were several schools within the locality, and each of those schools had a number of English teachers in them, so it was possible to set up school-based support groups. But the other area that we've made a lot of use of is teacher associations. So they're particularly important in English language teaching, and they don't necessarily exist in other subject areas, but people who are involved in those teacher associations are also quite keen in developing those ideas. But at the same time, the ministries of education have also picked up on these ideas and realized that they can add value, or they can use these kinds of processes to add value to their teacher development in a variety of different ways, and this can be done in cost-effective ways. So in cash-strapped environments where there's very limited funding, then these are possibilities. You do need some funding to do this. So to make the thing equitable, there are people who don't have the funding to be able to even to do the basic access that we're talking about with relatively modest tools. So if you want this kind of thing to work, you have to find some funding. So social media was the focus that I was particularly interested in, but they are very powerful tools, but they have their limitations. I mean, I'm currently making use of Telegram rather than WhatsApp, and actually Telegram has a lot more facilities built into it that make it sort of more powerful in what you can do, but still it has that basic sort of problem. It scrolls up the screen, and you have to keep reminding people to scroll back. So adding other sort of synchronous tools. So in the project that I work on at the moment with the Sub-Saharan African team in the British Council, we have monthly webinars, and there are also other kinds of webinars that go on. And the Telegram group that I work in is used as a way of wrapping around ideas as well as putting input in. We don't necessarily have to accept that, but we can try and make a difference. But groups are going to be unbalanced, so not everybody's going to contribute, and we have to accept that. But the evidence from the survey that I did seems to suggest that even if people don't contribute, a lot of people are taking something from it. So there are almost 1,900 people on this particular group that I'm working in on at the moment. And one of the reasons why people want to use Telegram is because you can have bigger groups. But if all 1,900 people contributed all the time, that really would be quite problematic. And just to reiterate, for projects to be sustainable, they need to start where teachers are, not where you want them to be. So, so you may have a bright idea, and I guess I might have had a bright idea a few years ago about using social media in this kind of way. But, still, I spent quite a lot of time actually doing some background research to see whether actually how many people how many people do have a mobile, how many people do have the internet access, and how many people are familiar with WhatsApp. So before I started using the tools in Jordan, which is where I began the experiment, I checked that people had access to it. And keep in mind all the time, teacher time. So one of the things that came out of the survey was that teacher time is limited, and already there are lots of issues that teachers face. Gender is also a significant issue. If you can avoid new toys, and if you can provide some data for your participants so that they can equitably access the materials or the activities that you're running. So I think that's there are a bunch of references there that you can follow up. So I did put in at the beginning, I put in a link to a Google version of these slides. So I've got quite a lot of information um, that are actually on the slides. So I'll put it in again. So I don't know whether people can access that, or how this material is shared. So it's not the workbook. The workbook is something a bit different. So you've gone back to that. So I put it in the chat. I don't know whether people can actually see the chat, but there are a set of slides that you can access. So maybe somebody at the conference can distribute that around. So if people want to follow it up and look at the references, they can do. So that's basically the presentation over.